students, welcome to our third and final lesson for the chapters Unit 1. So let's strike this. Unit 1, which was chapters 1 and 2. And this is basically lesson 3. I reorganized the lessons this year. So if you recall, what was our first lesson on? It was on how the sacraments follow us through our human life. And that's something that's true according to both science and the way we understand our faith. Then in chapter 1, we started dissecting the catechism's um, definition of sacrament. And today in lesson 3, we're going to finish that dissection. Okay, so recall the definition of sacrament. We handled this first part in the first lesson. It was sacraments are efficacious signs of grace instituted by Christ and entrusted to the church by which human life is dispensed to us. So that was in basically lesson 2. Again, this one is going to be lesson 3. Now, we're going to look at the rest of this definition. The visible rites by which the sacraments are celebrated signify and make present the graces proper to each sacrament. They bear fruit in those who receive them with required disposition. So let's take a look at what that means exactly. Okay. Okay. So we're saying that the sacraments are visible rites by which, or the visible rites by which the sacraments are celebrated, signify and make present the graces proper to each sacrament. So notice what we have here, visible rites. Remember what St. Augustine said about sacraments? Invisible graces are made visible. So and then it says here that they're rites. So a rite is a ritual, and we celebrate sacraments with the liturgy. Liturgy is defined on page 8 of your text as the public worship of the church, and the most important expression of which is the Mass. But there are all sacraments are a form of worship, and they each have their own rites. So they signify and make present grace. So the way that they do that is there are two. Well, actually, we can add a third. 3 essential elements to every sacrament. There's the form. These are the sacred words that are used during the sacrament. Then there's the matter. The matter is the physical symbols. So obviously, when we think of the Mass, we would think of the bread and wine and the Eucharist, but also gestures. For example, in confirmation, an important gesture is you're being anointed with the chrism. So, and there's also the minister. Each sacrament has a different minister. So, for example, the priest is the minister of the sacrament of Eucharist, whereas the married couple are the ministers of the sacrament of marriage because they're making a covenant with each other. So again, these different symbols and words are going to make present grace. So this is our guarantee that Jesus gave us that we will encounter God. He didn't want us to wonder if God was with us. He gave us a church and gave us a sacrament so that when we're experiencing them, we know grace is present. And how do human beings experience their world? Through our 5 senses. So we get words we can hear with our ears, gestures we can do with our bodies, words we can say with our mouths, even very visceral, like we have symbols that we can eat, but they aren't mere symbols. They actually make grace truly present. So obviously sacraments are highly symbolic, but again, they're not mere signs or symbols, they're incarnational. And remember, the incarnation means that, God became man in Christ. He put on flesh. The sacraments take these invisible, ineffable graces and allow us to touch them, to hold them, to interact with them in the way that's good for a human being. Sometimes in theology we say it's fitting, meaning it makes sense. It makes sense for humans to experience the world through their senses. So Jesus sacraments because each sacrament confers different graces. And when we looked at in the first lesson, the different phases of development that we saw in Fowler and Erickson, Jesus knew we grew and changed over time. He knew as we entered different states of life, we would need different graces. So he didn't just give us one sacrament we get when we're babies. He gave us sacraments to follow us through our lives so that at every important moment in our journey of faith, we would get more and more grace to sustain us on the way. I think it's pretty cool.
Okay, so continuing on here, I titled this slide Amazing but Not Magic. They bear fruit in those who receive them with required dispositions. So what that means is in the sacraments, God acts first and we respond. And the way we respond is by receiving the fullness of the graces intended by Christ. But you have to be in the proper spiritual condition. That's what they mean by properly disposed. So you can think of examples from your daily life where maybe you were not properly disposed to take a test. So I remember one time I had a girl come in from lunch. She's got her head down on her desk. There's mascara everywhere. She's crying. And I said, "What happened?" And she said, "My boyfriend just broke up with me by a text message." So rather than giving her the test, she wasn't properly disposed to it. She wasn't academically ready because her emotions were tearing her apart. I knew she couldn't focus at that moment. So I said, "All right, come make up the test another day." But that's the way it is with the sacraments. We have to be properly disposed. So one example of that is at the Mass. One of the things you'll notice that deacon or father says at Mass is that if you are ready to receive the Eucharist, you can come up. If not, you got to receive a blessing instead. And the reason for that is when one of the ways we're disposed to Eucharist is that we're free from sin when we receive Christ, at least free from mortal sin. So St. Paul says in his letters that to take Eucharist when you're in a state of sin brings the penalty of death. We have to be disposed to it. That's part of the reason why we prepare for our sacraments. Parents prepare for baptism for their children. You remember as confirmation candidates, you probably had to take 2 years of preparation to get ready for it. The reason why we do that is so that you're properly disposed. Now, sacraments make real ontological changes in us. And by ontological, we mean actual change at like a physical, spiritual level. And in physical realities, for example, the Eucharistic Mass, but they're not magic. So what I mean by that is we have to cooperate with the Holy Spirit in order to receive his grace. So if I do a magic spell on someone, it doesn't matter whether or not they want to participate, it's going to happen. So magic kind of takes away your freedom, but our God loves us and would never take away our freedom. If we don't cooperate with him, we can't receive the grace. So sometimes people will say, "Well, nothing happens to me at Mass." Well, maybe that's because you're not meeting God halfway. Remember, he's just asking you to respond to him. You don't actually have to do anything but be open to him. It's pretty simple, but a lot of times we close our hearts off. We don't listen to the readings. We come to Mass when we're not in a state of grace. We got to meet God halfway. So that's another important aspect in the definition of sacrament. Okay, finally, I'm going to sum up by saying what sacraments are not. So sometimes we mistake sacraments for like merit badges. When I was a youth minister and confirmation director, people treated confirmation like this is the last sacrament, I'm responsible for getting my kids as a parent. Like it's a merit badge. Like I got them all done. Now I'm done. That's not the way sacraments work. They're not the end of the story. They're the beginning of a story, a relationship with grace. So they aren't just merit badges to collect. They're not merely meaningless rituals. Sometimes the good thing about ritual is it's something that is familiar to us, that gives us a sense of confidence, that gives us a sense of security. The downside of ritual is when we do things the same way over and over, especially with sacraments we can repeat, like the Eucharist. Sometimes we go through the motions. And if that happens, that's a failure on our parts, not on the failure of the church or the sacraments. Part of what we have to do is, again, be ready to meet God like it's the first time every time in the sacraments. It's not a money-making venture for the church. The church is not getting rich off of offering the sacraments. The only reason why you might have to pay, say, for confirmation isn't you're not paying to get the sacrament. The church doesn't sell sacraments. But if you're going to go on a retreat, the church does have to pay for your room, your board, your food. So, it's the church Jesus gave us the sacraments himself. He didn't say, here's the sacraments, here's what you charge. But you do have to pay for the other, aspects of preparing for the sacraments, like retreats. Aside from baptism, they're not necessary for salvation, and we'll talk more specifically about what that means when we look at the sacrament of baptism. The one caveat to that would be Eucharist. Eucharist for baptized Catholics is necessary because we know the truth about what Eucharist is. So as a Catholic, for me to refuse to receive the Eucharist would be a mortal sin because I know what Eucharist is. I know it's truly the body and blood of Christ. So it would be sinful for me not to receive it. And this is the last thing I want to distinguish is they're not just rites of passage. I was a religious studies major, not a theology major. And one of the tendencies in religious studies at the time I was studying was a tendency to reductionism. Reductionism reduces religion to something that's not supernatural. So what they'll sometimes say is, oh, the sacraments are just rites of passage. So baptism is an initiation rite. Confirmation is a life cycle ceremony, or marriages are social transformation ceremonies. And it takes sort of God and grace out of it. So, for example, one definition of sacrament is a celebration that marks a change of status upon any of several important occasions at the onset of puberty or union, entry into a marriage or clan. So again, you'll notice that took God out of it, that took grace out of it. And as Catholics, sacraments aren't just rites of passage, because remember, sacraments confer actual grace. They actually change us from the inside out. Well, if we're doing it right, I should say. If we're not properly disposed, we won't change. So especially with the sacraments that have a sacramental character, remember sacramental character, those sacraments that have that are baptism, holy orders, confirmation, and then in a more limited sense, marriage. Those sacraments actually change your soul. They confirm in you this special sacramental character that changes you, like literally, like your soul. Like here's your soul. It was broken. It was gaping. And when they poured the water of baptism on there, that cleared up the wound of original sin. And with God's grace, he put stitches on your soul and fixed it. Those stitches are still there. Another way of looking at it is Blaise Pascal said, we have a God-shaped hole in our heart and it can only be filled by him. God basically tattoos up your soul and says, this one is mine. That's what sacraments do. That's why they're so rad. So we're going to take a look at some clips from How to Train Your Dragon. This one is going to be called Classwork 5. And we're going to use some clips from the film, and we're going to look, because this is ultimately a rite of passage story. And we're going to look at how sacraments are similar to rites of passage, because they are, but then also how they're different. And that's going to be the important part. So that will bring us to the conclusion of chapters 1 and 2. If you have any questions, just let me know.